Hello, and for this week's Kasucast, I'm going to talk about VR or virtual reality and how I use it in my art process. These few intro images, as well as the thumbnail, are some paintovers I did after modeling almost all of the geometry in Adobe Medium and Gravity Sketch. Both of these softwares are available on the Oculus Quest 2, which is the VR hardware I'm using. The peripheral geometry such as the red and yellow sci-fi wall panel and floor panels were created in Substance Designer. Everything was textured in Substance Painter and then rendered in Blender cycles. Paintover was done in Photoshop. Alright, now that that's out of the way, I'll show some time lapses of my modeling in Adobe Medium, which is probably the bulk of the hard work. To be honest, I think 50% of the project was completed right here in VR, which is pretty surprising. I would say that the modeling process took around 5 to 6 hours, and I did this in around 5 sittings, so a little over 1 hour each per sitting over about 5 days. In Medium, you are free to sculpt something from scratch using the default tools, but I used the clay brush in a different way. There is a feature in the clay brush that allows you to use pre-existing geometry as a stamp. You can import custom kitbash 3D geometry sets, then use the stamp feature to start placing geometry wherever you like. For reference, I'm using 2 kitbash sets. The first is Vitaly Bulgarov's Black Phoenix set, and the second set is the default mechanical set that comes with Medium. A key feature to enable precise placement of geometry is the utilization of the grid snap and angle snap features. This can be found in the layers palette or panel, and it's near the top above the layers structure. These help you orient your geometry in a rigid way. Otherwise, you might get some very avant-garde abstract architecture. However, if that's the look you're going for, these features could still be very useful in keeping your hand steady. If, say, for example, you want to stamp in geometry around in a helix shape. On a side note, you'll see that I save pretty often. Medium feels unstable sometimes due to the long save times, especially if you upscale your voxel mesh, which I recommend to not do until the very end, or if you're going to do some post-processing on your mesh in, for example, ZBrush, then you probably don't want to upscale at all. One of my favorite techniques is to place a stamp, then use the Move tool on the square setting to push or pull the geometry in a certain way. Using this in conjunction with the snap settings allows you to smudge your geometry into a certain shape or orientation. Once you pull your geometry in a certain way, you let go of the tool, and the voxels will automatically fill in and make accurate enough interpolations to finish your desired mesh shape. Something that I learned that saved me a lot of hassle later on was that when I wanted to make a large sweeping change using the Move brush, I should turn the grid snap setting to a high value such as 1 meter and the angle snap settings to 45 or 90 degrees. This way, even if your hand is unsteady, you still won't mess up your Move brush command. Another technique that makes VR so useful for quickly hard surfacing ideas is the ability to not just add geometry with the clay brush, but to do a boolean subtract by double tapping the light desaturated green gear icon on your dominant hand controller. If you do so, the clay preview will turn red instead of green, which means that you are now in subtract mode. I use this to great effect on the latter parts of the rear wall. At this point, I want to add a caveat about VR sculpting. While I mentioned that 50% of the work was done here, in Adobe Medium, about 20% of the remaining work was cleaning up the mesh in ZBrush and drawing UVs for each mesh piece. This brings me to my next point about having a rough idea of what materials each part of your scene is going to be assigned. If you don't consciously allocate your meshes to a specific layer, separating them later on will be a nightmare. Luckily, this is my second time using VR seriously in a project, so I had already learned from my previous transgressions. So enough about Medium for now. You may notice in the images that I showed that there were 3 mechanical robots in them. They look kind of like skeletal robots being put together frame by frame. These characters were created in Gravity Sketch using first the ink tool for an undersketch, then the stroke tool on square taper for the actual model. Sadly, setting up the capture software for Gravity Sketch took up too much time, and I was in a creative mood, so I just went ahead and modeled these mechs without recording them. A tip that might prove useful to everyone is that you are able to draw on a single layer in Gravity Sketch with different colors. When you export your FBX file, each piece of the mesh will be assigned a specific material. So for each mech layer that I exported, there were about 4 or 5 materials spanning across maybe 200 mesh pieces. In your 3D package, you can just select these individual materials and assign them new textures, making the process very painless. Initially, I thought that all meshes would get a global material, which terrified me. Separating those meshes by hand would be a bad time. When I consider myself moving forward in the future, using VR feels a lot swifter and intuitive compared to employing the more traditional methods of blocking in a mesh. In ZBrush, you'd have to start with a Z-sphere, and pull and drag out more Z-spheres, then make an adaptive mesh or dynamesh. This takes quite a while. However, in VR, you can get a pre-visualization layout in just a little over half a day's work. Less if you don't need to go so hard on the details. Lastly, I want to show how much of a difference painting over in Photoshop makes. Earlier, I mentioned that 70% of the process was modeling and cleaning the mesh. The remaining breakdown is 15% texturing in Substance Painter and 15% Photoshop paintover. What I'll do is show the original render and then the finished painting side by side. Enjoy.